This is Eric Weiss, and this is Rabbi Elliot Kukla. Hi. We want to recognize that we're engaged in this wonderful miracle of technology, and so want to just say that we're so grateful to be with you today, and to say that we know that everybody decides how they spend their time, and so we want to say just thank you for saying yes to spending this time together to talk about this particular issue. I'm going to begin by offering you a basic frame for thinking about this issue of spiritual care and mental illness and the creation of a caring community in your synagogue structures. Then I'm going to give you just a very brief history about how the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center comes to this particular topic. And in that context, I'll explain just a little bit about the Healing Center itself. And then we're going to jump in by using the brochure that we previously sent to you as a way to really get into the meat of the conversation. And as you heard earlier from Adam and Edie, we'll stop partway through, and then we'll take questions and answers and engage in some dialogue among us. So first, the frame. I want to ask you just to consider this for a moment, and perhaps in your own particular space, maybe take notes on this particular frame as you move along. I'd like to ask you to think of a time that you interacted with mental illness. That could be within yourself, it could be with a loved one, with a friend, or with a congregant. So please think of a time you yourself interacted with mental illness within yourself, or with a loved one, or with a friend, or with a congregant. And then we want to ask you to think about what the personal and programmatic elements are that you would like to have in place for that interaction to go well. What are the personal and programmatic elements that you'd like to have in place for that interaction to go well? So, for example, you might have some personal qualities that you want to have in place, like being able to be patient, or be empathetic, or even be curious. You might want to, on an intellectual level, have a broader knowledge of mental illness itself. You might even want to be able to know that there's a program in place at your synagogue where you could say, for example, oh, we're having our monthly Shabbat potluck next Friday night for people who live with mental illness before Shabbat services. Please come. Or you might want to have, in a very practical way, emergency phone numbers that you can give somebody. For example, a suicide hotline prevention phone number in your local area. So thinking of a time you interacted with mental illness, what are the personal and programmatic elements that you would like to have in place for that interaction to go well? So I'm going to move now to giving you just a brief history of how the Healing Center comes to this particular topic, and then move into the brochure as a way to get into the meat of the conversation. The Bay Area Jewish Healing Center is the first Jewish healing center in the country. We provide Jewish spiritual care and support to folks who are ill, dying, and bereaved. For those of you who are not familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, geographically we serve the 5 counties of Sonoma County, Marin County, San Francisco, and what's called the peninsula into San Mateo County. It's the west side of the San Francisco Bay Area from Sonoma County, where wine country is down south toward the area where Stanford University is and Silicon Valley, for those of you who may not be familiar with our geography. We noticed many, many years ago that people would come to us, and I'm just going to give you a kind of a composite example. A woman came to us who said, my brother just died, and he died in New York. I just got back from his funeral in Shiva, and everybody in New York was wonderful to us. And when I came back to my own synagogue, my rabbi was wonderful, and the community that I have here was wonderful. We did a shloshim service, and it really was very supportive. But the one thing that I never told anybody is that actually my brother lived with schizophrenia. And really, what happened was, he was on the streets of Manhattan, and my mother got a phone call from the police department that they found him dead in an alleyway. And I just never told anybody that. And I grew up with a brother who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was quite young, and so I lived with a brother who lived with schizophrenia essentially my entire childhood. Or a man would come to us and say, I just came back from another state outside of California where we buried my mother, and everybody was wonderful, and I've come back and everybody has been really kind to me. But the one thing that I haven't really said to anybody is that my mother lived with chronic depression her entire life. And I suspect that by accident or on purpose, she mixed her medications in a way that brought her life to an end, and I haven't told anybody this. And out of those experiences, people really reflected very seriously on the spiritual nature of their experience. And this, for us, is very important to say for our continuing conversation. There is a lot of information that one can get on the psychological or the psychiatric aspects of mental illness. There's a lot that you can do when it comes to lobbying on the political sphere about one's local or national public policy issues about mental illness and mental health. And there's a lot that can be done when you talk about what therapies work. But from the perspective of our agency's mission of providing spiritual care and the way we read this issue in the community is what really needs to be developed is how we understand the spiritual undercurrent to what it means to live with mental illness. And for us, what it means to live with mental illness means both for somebody who has a loved one who has a mental illness as well as somebody who themselves has something such as they live with schizophrenia, they live with chronic depression, clinical depression, they live with having had a psychotic break, etc. So for us, the focus is the spiritual care aspect of living with mental illness. I also just want to tell you that the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center is trans-denominational. It happens that myself and Rabbi Kukla are ordained through the Reform movement, and in our other parts of our rabbinate personal lives, we have a commitment to the Reform movement. But the Healing Center itself is trans-denominational. We serve every Jewish individual or Jewishly connected individual in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that includes a majority of Jews in our community who are unaffiliated. But the Jewish Healing Center provides its service regardless of affiliation or ability to pay, and so our work in that arena is community-wide. So with that, I want to just tell you that, give you a context for where this brochure comes from and why we want to use it with you now. In the context of our developing direct service for people who live with mental illness, one of the things that we developed was an understanding of how to systemically change synagogue life to break the stigma of mental illness in the Jewish community. And so we developed a half-day synagogue-based conference that would be focused on issues of mental illness. And there are many components to this half-day conference, but one of them was that for us to go in and work with a synagogue on this conference was for the synagogue to commit to doing something beyond the conference itself. And so the conference was not going to be an ad hoc experience. It would be a kind of continuing conversation beyond the conference itself. And so in that context, we've done this conference 5 times in both Reform and conservative synagogues. 2 of those synagogues are Congregation Beth Am in Los Altos Hills and also Temple Isaiah in Lafayette, California, both URJ congregations. And among the 5 congregations, leadership developed out of the experience of doing this conference with them and beyond with all the other programming that they've done and which the Healing Center has been a part of. And in particular, 2 congregants. One is Jane Marcus from Congregation Beth Am and Diana McKee from Temple Isaiah. Became leaders in their particular synagogues for the programming around mental illness issues at their particular synagogue, and one of the results of which was that they were successful about a year ago in obtaining a URJ Cotimer grant to specifically produce a facilitator's guide for mental illness programming in one synagogue, as well as this particular brochure. And this brochure is going to be produced also by the Healing Center. I'll let Rabbi Mensher know in about a week or so how you can get this brochure otherwise, but the Healing Center is in the process of producing this brochure in such a way that a synagogue, if it wishes to, can personalize it by putting their own logo on this brochure and then using in their particular synagogue structure. If you look at the brochure, you might notice that the copyright belongs to both the URJ and the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center. Rabbi Kuklat and I wrote this brochure, and we maintain joint copyright. It might be the first time, just incidentally, that the Reform Movement has done a joint copyright with another agency out there in the community that isn't necessarily Reform Movement enterprise, but I think that that's an extraordinarily positive signal within the Reform Movement of really making itself available to the broader Jewish landscape on many different levels. So that's just a little brief history about how the Healing Center comes to this particular issue. So I'm going to now turn it over to Rabbi Elliot Kukla, and he and I are going to kind of go back and forth using the brochure as a nodal point for moving into this issue more deeply. And then our hope is that in about 15, 20 minutes we'll stop and that we'll start to engage each other with questions and answers and more dialogue.
Hi, this is Elliot. Good to be with all of you. So I want to pick up where Rabbi Weiss left off in terms of turning to the brochure, which is a spiritual framework for approaching mental illness. And as many of you might have heard, something like 60% of people go to their clergy person first when they find out that they are dealing with a mental illness. And there are all sorts of practical and communal reasons for that, but we really feel like there's spiritual reasons as well. That illness in general and mental illness in particular stimulate spiritual issues and spiritual longings that Eric is going to speak a little bit more about as well. And that someone can have all the best medical care. They can have a wonderful psychiatrist helping them with medications. They could have a wonderful social worker helping with the social and psychosocial impact of mental illness, and that when they are struggling, they still might have a voice in their head that is saying something like, why me? Or how does this fit into a bigger picture of reality? Or is God speaking to me right now, or is this just part of my illness? Or distinctly spiritual questions that need to be tended to. So because we live in a world with a lot of therapy, thank God, people often tend to immediately switch into a psychological mode when we come to help them with mental illness. So there's a lot of ways that you can signal coming to tend to the spiritual aspects of mental illness, providing senses of connection and belonging and meaning that can come specifically through spirituality. There are many ways, like starting with silence or bringing a challah and starting with a motzi. And one of the ways also is to begin with a blessing. And this blessing is in your brochure, and I'm going to open with this blessing for all of us. Also to acknowledge that likely all of us on this call in some way have been touched in our lives by mental illness, whether it's personally in our own journeys or in our families or in our congregations. This is not an issue that is far away. This is an issue that impacts each one of us, maybe in intensely personal ways. So I'll start by offering this blessing for all of us. May the one who blessed our ancestors bless all who live with mental illness, our caregivers, families, and friends. May we walk in the footsteps of Jacob, King Saul, Miriam, Hannah, and Naomi, who struggled with dark moods, hopelessness, isolation, and terrors, but survived and led our people. Just as our father Jacob spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed, may all who live with mental illness be granted the endurance to wrestle with pain and prevail night upon night. Grace us with the faith to know that though, like Jacob, we may be wounded, shaped, and renamed by this struggle, still we will live on to continue an ever-unfolding, unpredictable path toward healing. May we not be alone on this path, but accompanied by our families, friends, caregivers, ancestors, and the Divine Presence. Surround us with loving kindness, grace, and companionship, and spread over us a Sukkot Shalom, a shelter of peace and wholeness. And let us say, Amen.
One of the aspects that mark a spiritual care approach to people with mental illness versus any other is really embodied in the prayer that Elliot wrote and just read, which is referencing our biblical figures and heroes and the way that they worked with whatever it was that they were experiencing in their lives. So what I want to just point out in terms of an obvious way is this prayer doesn't mention anything that you might think of as psychologically diagnostic. It doesn't particularly reference anything of what you might consider to be a kind of a treatment framework, but it does recognize the experience of mental illness, and it recognizes that one is placed within the context of the broader Jewish landscape, in fact, the biblical landscape of the experience of mental illness as well. So all illness, and certainly mental illness, naturally stimulates spiritual reflection and reasonably yearns for a communal response. One of the things that's very important to pay attention to about all illness, but certainly mental illness, is that it can be very isolating. And isolation, as opposed to solitude, isolation itself runs counter to spiritual experience for one particular reason. At the core of all spiritual experience is a sense that one is part of something bigger at work in the world than just oneself. Now, you might use the word God there, or you might not. In some 12-step frameworks, in the United States in particular, people will use the term higher power. But what we mean by this is that all spiritual yearning strives to understand how an individual is part of something bigger in the world beyond themselves. And so isolation within the context of mental illness can run counter to somebody being able to stimulate their own spiritual experience. And so creating a caring community with simple things like visiting somebody breaks out of that isolation and encourages them to be in community. Another part of spiritual experience is understanding how awe, A-W-E, functions. All spiritual experience at a certain point accounts for how somebody experiences awe, A-W-E. And I want to suggest to you, you may or may not disagree with this, but I just want to suggest to you, if you break down awe in and of itself, it really is an interesting combination of places where we are curious about the world around us and places where we feel a sense of caution about the world around us. So, for example, if you just think of yourself in this moment and something that is spiritual for you, for a great number of people, nature is an experience of spirituality that people really are drawn to. Hiking, walking on the beach, something like that. And in that context, there's both this sense of attraction to something majestic like the sea or a view, and then at the same time, a little bit of caution around the bigness of all of it. And in that context, one feels that one is part of something greater. So part of trying to break the stigma of mental illness and that experience is to try to bring people out of isolation and into a community so it's easy for them to understand that they're cared for and stimulate that little aspect of the spiritual experience. What's really important, I think, to say about this really simple foundation is you do not have to know anything about mental illness to provide compassion or a caring presence. And that's a really important thing to pay attention to when you're thinking about what you do as a caring community. Caring communities sometimes feel that they have to know absolutely everything about a topic before they can decide what to do to care for somebody with, for example, cancer or who's had a heart attack. But that's actually not true. So you might be a little bit cautious about issues around mental illness. You might yourself be very curious about it. But you don't have to know detail about mental illness to be a caring person to somebody who lives with mental illness. You just have to understand what it means to be a caring individual and to move into that caring space with people. At this juncture, we want to just ask Edie if you've gotten any questions or not, but before we move forward, if there are any other questions so far that we should pay attention to before we go on.
Yes, one question was, in thinking about mental illness in the lives of our members of our congregations, could you comment on the basic issue of how do we know? In contrast to disability inclusion, where many disabilities are evident, don't we have a different situation with mental illness? Someone in deep depression, for example, may hide. How does outreach work in a way that, how do we do outreach work in a way that is caring and still respectful?
This is Elliot. I think that's such a wonderful, wonderful question. I mean, and the simple answer is that we don't know. And we need to think about this on a very deep cultural level of how do we create communities where there is the opening so that people can let us know. And I think there are some really simple cultural things that can happen. Like, for example, if you are in a congregation where a public Misha Bera is done during services for healing, to just add the word, you say if there are people suffering from physical or mental illnesses in need of healing, please name them or add them to our list in our handout if we have one. Because if people just hear illnesses, they won't think that that includes mental illness. And we have really found in our work that the more often that mental illness can simply be mentioned in the congregational life, the conferences that Eric mentioned is one way of doing this. Some of the communities we've worked with have done things like communal aliyot for people struggling with mental illness. But the more that the language is normalized, the more there's space for people to come forward and disclose what they're struggling with. The other piece in answer to this question that I would say is that part of having a caring community is also keeping our eye on who is disappearing. Because even though we don't necessarily know, you probably have some hunches and some instincts that sometimes, because of the stigma around mental illness, we don't follow up on. So, for example, there might be a member of the community that you've seen kind of up and down in their moods, and you might, and more or less present, and you might wonder if they're struggling with depression, and then they just stop coming to services. This happens really often with elderly people and depression. There's other limitations that make it hard to come, and they just sort of stop showing up. And what happens far too often is then that person disappears. So, and might be disappearing in a way that they're not getting support or community from anyone. So part of this work is a little countercultural in that we live in a society that is kind of hands-off about illness and doesn't ask and doesn't show up. Part of it might be being more proactive and making sure people don't disappear, and if you notice someone is missing, to give them a call. And even if they say, everything's okay, it might mean checking in.
I want to just add to Rabbi Kukla's comment, which is that it's such a crucial question to really talk about and reflect upon in whatever structures you have in your local synagogue for this particular issue around caring. But the goal is not for people to disclose. The goal is for the community to care. So all congregational life strives to let people know that they are welcome. And there are lots of signals that we send and work with sending if we want to make sure that people without children are welcome, or to tell people who are in interfaith families that they are welcome. And there are lots of ways in which we do that. So in that same context, you can think about ways in which a synagogue's culture change needs to be put into place to give the signal that people who live with mental illness are welcome. Just to draw another little comparison, many people in the United States over the past several years have had tremendous financial struggles. But that wasn't something that we expect somebody to announce in a public way. There's a lot of embarrassment about that. There are lots of different factors there. And the goal isn't to make somebody reveal something that feels so vulnerable that they're not going to be able to move through that challenge. The goal is for someone to know that whether they can pay synagogue dues or not, they're still a member of the community and they're welcome and they have a way that they can contribute. And so if you, by comparison, take this to the issue of mental illness, the goal isn't particularly to disclose. The goal is to create a culture of care for people to understand that when they experience mental illness, there is a community to which they belong and where they can feel comfortable and safe, whether they talk about it or they don't talk about it. Just a little bit of an asterisk to this is that, at least in the United States, the statistics are that both 1 in 4 Americans will experience mental illness in their lifetime, and by and large, nearly every single person, now this is not 100%, but nearly every person will have, during the course of their lifetime, approximately 6 weeks' worth of what might be considered a mental illness episode, or maybe even perhaps a psychiatric episode. So I want to just break that down and say that it's very common and not particularly very well spoken about that a woman will have a postpartum depression. And this is something that is really so common but rarely talked about. Now, it may not be that a synagogue will have a postpartum depression group or understanding, but that synagogue can create a caring community so that when everybody is congratulating the mother and the father on their new baby and there's a baby naming, that there's also scaffolding in place that somebody calls that family 6 to 8 weeks out just to check in with a particular understanding about how things are going. So that's just one little example about you can move toward culture change, but you don't necessarily have the goal of people disclosing if they don't want to.
Yeah, that's a wonderful qualification, that the goal is for people to feel cared for. So to a certain extent, some of it is intuitive. I think stigma sometimes catches us up from doing the natural things that we would to express welcome and caring. So I just wanted to say a few words on what Jewish tradition has to say about mental illness. So there are a number of different mitzvot, sacred obligations, that guide how we might respond in our community to mental illness. The most obvious one is Bikor Cholim, the mitzvah of visiting the sick. There's also a concept that is very deep in Jewish tradition and caught up with Bikor Cholim, which is Haknasat Orchim, which is hospitality. And I think what Eric was just saying about extending welcome is so crucial. The Jewish concept of hospitality, I feel like, extends to welcome in our congregations to people with mental illness, and also welcome to all parts of people's lives, since so many of us will have periods of mental illness or severe emotional distress. I really extend the concept of hospitality to the sense of full self. There's also a very important Jewish concept of derech eretz, which is, I think, one that is sometimes not emphasized as much as we could when we talk about Bikor Cholim, that derech eretz of treating others with dignity is equally important, and I think some of the things Eric was just saying touches on that as well, of really bearing in mind people's dignity in responding to them, and that might mean that for some people that privacy is really important. So these are very general Jewish mitzvot that apply to many different situations, including mental illness, and I think they're important in that they are mitzvot that will apply to each one of us. So there are times in our life when we will need to offer Bikor Cholim, and there are times in our life when we will need to be visited when we are sick. And this is true for all of these. None of these are one-sided mitzvot. They are not things that we do as from a kind of sense of do-gooding, but they are part of what it takes to build a community of reciprocity and care. And often what separates someone who's being visited in a moment of severe emotional distress and the person who's doing the visiting is really timing. since so many of us will struggle with these things in ourselves or our families through our lives. The other thing I wanted to say about Jewish tradition and mental illness is that the category of mental illness is a very modern category. However, in Jewish sacred texts, in the Bible itself, there are a lot of characters who live with experiences that in a modern context we very well might call mental illness. So, for example, we know that in the book of Samuel, King Saul would periodically be overcome by Ruach Ra'ah, bad spirit. And the only thing that would cheer him up was music, actually, when he was in this place. And having these kind of periods of deep sadness followed by periods of elation might be considered bipolar illness in today's world. We know that Hannah, when she was struggling with infertility and the suffering that came with that, went into the temple and spoke out loud to God. And in the atmosphere of the Bible, the priests of the temple interpret her speaking to a presence that can't be seen as delusional or a hallucination, which is not so dissimilar from how we sometimes respond to people who are speaking to someone we can't see in today's world. Also, we know that Naomi in the book of Ruth, after she suffers the loss of her husband and her 2 sons, falls into what is hard to not see as a deep depression, a grief-triggered depression, which is a common form of depression. And she is, in fact, so alienated from herself that she no longer wants to be called Naomi, which means pleasantness, and instead says, call me Mara, which means bitter. And it really reminds me of when people who are in the midst of depression say to me, I'm not myself. I don't recognize myself right now. I am so deep with despair. So I raise all these examples to highlight the fact that they're part of Jewish sacred texts. These texts are all read at different times in the liturgical cycle. The book of Ruth, for example, is read during the holiday of Shavuot. They are all designed to be proclaimed in the middle of our holy spaces, in the middle of our holy time, which is very different from the way that today's world sometimes deals with periods of emotional distress. And instead of cloaking them with stigma or shame, they're part of the social world of ancient Israel and part of the social world of Jewish holy texts. And I don't mean to say that this means that these experiences are good. I just mean to say that they are normalized within Jewish tradition and often are part of the full tapestry of what makes some of these characters such full human figures and can contribute in interesting ways to their greatness as leaders to our people, not to minimize the incredible suffering of emotional distress, but just to highlight its humanness. And there is a kind of breaking down of isolation around emotional distress and mental illness that can happen just by pointing out that these texts are within our tradition and are resources to keep us company when we are suffering.
I'm going to use the notion of preparing for visiting somebody with mental illness as a kind of metaphor and also literally to just kind of make some points around this issue of creating a caring community around those who live with mental illness. So I want to start with some assumptions and some comments that might seem countercultural. You may or may not disagree. You may or may not agree or disagree with this, but these are things that I think are just very important to think about. When we talk about mental illness, at least in the United States, there's a tendency to avoid some experiences and move toward others that we feel a little bit more, let's say, comfortable with. So sometimes people will put issues of addiction and issues of dementia into the category of mental illness. Now, there's an argument to be made for example, these two human experiences in the context of mental illness. But our experience is where communities focus on those issues, they end up neglecting some of the harder, more important issues around mental illness to which stigma really does it here, and then people don't get served and they don't get cared about. So for us, when we talk about mental illness, we talk about very specific, what you might think of as psychiatric illnesses, such as the experience of schizophrenia, this great experience of being diagnosed bipolar, clinical depression, psychotic breaks, that kind of mental illness experience. And that's delivered on our part. Another point I want to make is that when you talk about visiting somebody with mental illness as an example and also as a metaphor, what you're talking about is an experience where there's a natural movement toward isolation and a way in which Judaism, I think, a little bit of a countercultural approach to, say, an American approach. So I want to be really specific in certain ways. Lots of times when somebody gets sick, we say to them, tell me what you need, I'm there for you. And then we wait for them to tell us what they need. And we don't proactively respond. Now, that's not a bad thing to do, but in this particular context, I want to suggest it's actually not the way to go. Because people, when they're sick anyway, but certainly when they experience mental illness, don't really know what they need, because illness, and certainly mental illness in and of itself, is a self-alienating experience, and people don't know their own inner landscape and therefore aren't aware of what they need. So you might think of it, and I'm just using this as a metaphor, and I'm being a little bit reductionist just to make the point. A child needs to be told what he or she needs, or what he or she needs to do. That's part of child rearing. A lot of us, as we go through life, when we come to a point where we don't know something, or we're new to something, we do need to be told what, in some cases, we need. So I want to suggest that perspective to you when it comes to issues around caring for people with mental illness. It's not effective to say to somebody that you know is living with mental illness to just call you when they need something and you'll be there for them. It's really important in this particular context to not give up on a relationship, to be proactive, and to pursue it. So for example, to say, I'm going to swing by and pick you up for Shabbat services at 7, so we'll get there on time, and I want you to sit next to me. Or somebody comes through the door of the synagogue, and you greet them, and you say, come, I'd like you to sit with me, if you see somebody sitting by themselves. Or I'm just going to sit down here next to you. That kind of a thing. There's lots and lots of ways to do this, but I think that's just sort of to make the point that it's important to be proactive. Sending people an email, leaving a voicemail message, sending somebody a card, things that are passive but that somebody will receive when they're able to open up an email or get their voicemail messages or open their mail, is a way of saying we care about you, and it's proactive on the end of caring. So when you think of what it means to visit somebody with mental illness, it's really important that you pay attention to ways that you can be proactive and assertive in your caring to include them, rather than just saying, we've got a system in place and it relies exclusively on somebody who has mental illness to actually trigger the experience. That will, in many cases, not work. So I'm going to turn it over to Elliot. He's going to talk a little bit about another aspect of this.
Thank you.
For one moment, this is Rabbi Mencher. I just wanted to relate a couple of questions. Is this a good moment?
Yeah, go
a couple of
ahead.
questions. Is this a good time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the first one is, one of our congregants has just gone through ECT and his family didn't know how to deal with it, and we don't know what to say to them. If we don't have an understanding of ECT, what are the ways we can reach out to them? That's the first question.
That's an excellent question. So again, you don't have to know a treatment or a diagnosis to be supportive. So simply saying things like, what was that like for you? Or how was it that you came to that decision? Or do you think it helped or not helped? To ask essentially self-reflective questions that really show that you're curious about the person and their experience and how they're experiencing it. So that's a perfect example of you don't have to restrict caring to a knowledge base. Not knowing how somebody feels about ECT or what it was like doesn't mean that you can't express a curiosity about it. And I guess just to say the obvious, it's important to ask questions out of curiosity to elicit conversation rather than being declarative about caring. In other words, there's a difference to say, oh, I imagine that is rough for you, I'm so sorry, and then change the subject or something else, rather than saying, oh my gosh, how was that for you?
I couldn't agree more with Rabbi Weiss, and I also want to add in that, how was that for you, to leave space for someone, to be with someone in silence. So ECT is something that does bring up a lot of fear and stigma for people. So there is a tendency, in the same way that we respond to sometimes to suicide or other kinds of things that are really scary for us, to not want to engage with the issue. So I agree completely with using our curiosity, but also to allow some space for, you may not want to talk about it. I'm here to, I'm curious to hear about it, and also allow for, oh, you don't want to talk with it, I'm just going to sit with you in shul right now. And you really don't need to know anything about the medical treatment itself to not leave someone alone in that experience. It could be as simple as, we know you just went through this in your family, that's a very scary experience. I'm going to make sure that someone is always there to greet you at the door. I'm going to make sure that I'm sitting next to you in synagogue, because the very natural human response to someone going through something that is unknown for us is the opposite. It's to pull away a bit. So in noticing that feeling like, oh, I must need more information or knowledge in order to pull closer, to realize that you really don't need the information to pull closer. You just need the caring and the compassion to pull closer.
I think just to sort of round that out, I think that it's oftentimes really just a wonderful affirmation of caring to acknowledge that somebody's shared something that might be scary even to share. So to even say to somebody, gosh, I just want you to know how honored I am that you even just told me that, and thank you. I can imagine that it might have been scary for you to even think about whether you would even tell me or say that out loud, and I want to say thank you for letting me know.
One more piece. This is one of those topics we could talk about forever, but just how much that you don't need to understand someone's situation to express caring for them, that there is empathy you can draw on within yourself, because we have all had experiences of feeling a sense of profound loving from someone who probably didn't understand where we're at. It might have been a stranger on the street, or a relative of a very different generation, or even someone who didn't know the same language. But we can all tap into what it feels like to have a sense of caring from someone, even if they didn't know why we needed that caring and didn't understand the full knowledge, and know that we have the capacity to offer that as well.
I wanted to ask another question now, and I think this relates to your distinguishing between dementia and substance abuse and the more serious psychiatric disorders that you said are the focus of your in- and outreach work. And one of our participants asked, can I assume extreme anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, would also be included, though at times they might not result in what appears to be the same extent of dysfunction?
Yes, of course. So that it's one of the things that we've sort of discovered is that we don't want to sort of stimulate, sort of a hierarchy of what mental illnesses are most important to pay attention to and which are not, and which are sort of mainstreamed and which are stigmatized. It's really to say that sometimes we take a route that makes it just more palatable for us to deal with this issue, and it ends up being something that we do that is more window dressing than really getting into the issue, and that's what prevents caring. So yes, a very cogent argument can be made that when somebody, let's say for example, becomes sober, that they discover that really they were using alcohol as a medication, and in fact they are diagnosed as clinically depressed, and part of their sobriety is to engage in therapeutic treatment for that issue. And yes, other behaviors like repetitive perseveration that might be causing anxiety, or hoarding, or some other repetitive action that might be something that a psychiatrist might treat, is all part and parcel of it. But our biggest message is that in a caring community, when you talk about spiritual care, it's important to not fall into the trap of getting to know something more seriously from a medical perspective, or from a therapeutic perspective, or from a psychological perspective, because those things move you out of what it means to care on a spiritual level as a synagogue. And there are a ton of other professionals who deal with those issues effectively outside the synagogue. The synagogue is a place that says, whatever you have, you're welcome here.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify that I don't think, we didn't mean to imply in that question that dementia or addiction was less serious than mental illness, because of course both addiction and dementia can kill you. So that it's not a matter of creating a hierarchy in that way, but just making sure that we don't sidestep some of the issues surrounding mental illness, since so much stigma can attach itself to it that it's easy for us to slip off that topic.
I mean, just as an example, if you give yourself this test as an individual or as a community, to what degree are you equally comfortable walking in to see a congregant in a memory care clinic and or a psychiatric unit? And that answer can sort of tell you where your comfort might be or not be, and the issue is that we ought to feel as comfortable, if we can, walking into a psychiatric unit as we would into any other hospital room.
Are there more questions, Edie, or should I turn to a new topic?
Well, I was thinking of raising a question myself, which was, are there specific approaches or thoughts that you have about addressing suicide prevention, particularly when there has been a suicide or a number of suicides in the surrounding community?
Thank you. That is a really important question. So there's a number of different answers. There's a lot out there in terms of that you can go to in terms of looking up suicide prevention strategies and when you might need to call that in. You can call 1-800-SUICIDE from anywhere in the country to get a trained suicide prevention specialist 24/7. And that's a good phone number just to have in the back of your pocket. It's often really helpful when working with someone with mental illness or visiting someone with mental illness to have a little, an agreement so that that's in place. That is something like, if I'm feeling like I might want to hurt myself, I will call so-and-so, so that you can point to that when those issues come up. So all of that is in the psychological and therapeutic framework, and it's very, very important to have that in place and just, have that 1-800-SUICIDE number posted in your congregation and in the pocket of anyone who's going to visit someone with mental illness, since mental illness can lead to suicidality. However, I also do want to add another aspect to this, which is that feelings of suicidality or wanting to die are very common in people who are suffering in any way, in severe pain, whether that's the pain of physical illness or mental illness. And sometimes those really important referrals that can save someone's life is both the beginning and the end of the spiritual care. So I want to suggest that you need to have those referrals, and you should I don't quite have time right now to go through all of the signs of when you should trigger those referrals. You can find them easily online, and I can send you the link as a follow-up of when you should be really concerned that someone might hurt themselves. But in addition to that, I think a spiritual approach also means staying with someone in their feelings of hopelessness. So it is really tempting when someone says, I want to die, to instantly go to, oh, no, don't, you are so important. You can't do that. Things are going to look up soon. And what that does essentially is it abandons someone in those feelings, because they are in a place of despair and hopelessness, and if we go immediately to things are going to be better soon, and that doesn't ring true for the person we're with, then they are left alone in those feelings. So I would like to suggest that at the same time as keeping an eye on when things are really getting dangerous and knowing we have those phone numbers, that we also use our curiosity, as Rabbi Weiss was talking about, also with people's feelings of despair. So if someone says, I'm feeling so hopeless, to say, instead of, you need to have hope, which so many people will say immediately because feelings of hopelessness are scary, to say something like, what does that feel like for you? Or, that sounds really painful. Can you tell me about how long you've been feeling hopeless? And instead of offering a fix, to offer companionship. So there might be moments, like I have said, that are life-threatening, that you need to call 111 and offer a fix. If someone is saying, I have a bottle of pills in my hands, then you might need to offer a fix. But for a lot of people, feelings of hopelessness and despair are not an immediate threat to their life, but something they're living with chronically. So in those moments, instead of going straight to the fix, offering things like, I see how much pain you're in, and I want to be with you. I'm not going to leave you alone in your suffering right now. The congregation or me wants to be with you when you're in this much pain.
I want to just add, I know we don't have that much time left, but I want to just add a few comments about this, because suicide is a huge topic. And I think it's important to realize that suicide is a result. And typically, it's the result of somebody who essentially wants to be relieved of pain, and that person is essentially, I would say, untethered otherwise. That the most important thing is that we have just really honest, transparent conversation about suicide itself on lots and lots of levels. It's a huge topic because still in the United States, for example, there's a huge percentage of adolescent boys, and now even more girls, who are LGBT or may not be LGBT but think they are, who attempt suicide, even in the most progressive urban areas of our country. There are people who make some choices about how they want to end their life when they get a dementia diagnosis. There are people then, of course, who live with mental illness who commonly think of what does it mean for me to be out of my pain, and to make choices about how they're going to end their life. And we all know that in this day and age in the United States, there are some very potent organizations that lobby legally for people to make choices about how to end their life legally within a medical context. So the issue of suicide is huge, and the most important thing is to realize suicide is the result of something. And so the undercurrent is the work of the caring community culture. So again, the most potent antidote to suicide just in general is to make sure that the community is clear that everybody belongs and that everybody is cared for. And part of what is done in that context is that we actually do talk about it on all quarters of synagogue life.
I just want to add that there's actually really, there's been a number of studies and compelling evidence that one of the biggest risk factors for suicide is a lack of a feeling of belonging, is the intense pain combined with feeling a sense of not belonging anywhere. So I think that just makes it so clear of where congregational and community life can have such a huge impact, since belonging is really one of the key aspects of congregational life, and do a kind of subtle suicide prevention that's not the kind of 911 triage, which is to a certain extent a Band-Aid, but actually support people with mental illness, not by telling them, oh, no, don't feel that sad, but by providing a sense of belonging for the feelings of sadness and hopelessness and normalizing them, that can actually address the root causes of the pain and not just addressing the symptom the way immediate suicide prevention does.
So I know we need to end, but I just want to give one liturgical suggestion. Usually the only time when we recognize sadness on Shabbat services is at the Kaddish, and maybe sometimes in a communal Misha Beirach. But how powerful it would be if we would figure out a way in our liturgical experience every Friday night and Saturday morning to figure out a way to acknowledge other feelings and joy and happiness and celebration, so that people who even privately are depressed or feeling sad or feeling as if their feelings have no room in the synagogue actually get acknowledged liturgically from the pulpit, and how powerful that would be other than at the Kaddish. Feel free to contact us as you wish. We're available to you.